Hey everyone, this is the section of Maximilien Rubel and Margaret Manale's Marx Without Myth. The section is titled Karl Marx, 1873 to 1883. Covers the last decade of Marx's life. It is perhaps extreme to term the last decade of Marx's life a, quote, slow death, end quote, as his biographer Franz Mehring and others after him have done, yet this long period of illness was certainly one of agony and decline as well. There was scarcely a day when he did not suffer from fierce headaches, chronic hepatitis, bronchial or pulmonary infections, or furunculosis. High cerebral blood tension, high cerebral blood tension, and the resulting danger of apoplexy forced him to reduce his workday to a minimum. He made frequent trips to the seaside and to mineral springs, hoping to restore his health. He seemed, however, to be unaware of his deteriorating physical state, expected improvement to come, and read with a passion that betrayed his invincible belief in a future period of renewed creativity when he would accomplish all his unfinished projects. He filled about 50 notebooks with excerpts from his readings, nearly 30,000 pages covered with his minuscule handwriting, tons of material which he consumed and collected amazed Engels. The tons of material which he consumed and collected amazed Engels, who continued to be Marx's greatest ally in the proletarian struggle and his most intrepid defender against the calumnious attacks from the jealous and threatened bourgeoisie. Marx resumed time and again the work on Volume 2 of Capital without ever finishing the manuscript as planned. Apart from circulars, speeches, and other short compositions, Marx's writing was restricted to his correspondence. In January, he composed a number of brief writings. On the 3rd of 1873, the London Times published his refutation of an article in the same paper which had insinuated that he was the, quote, autocrat of the proletarian movement. For the Italian Almanacco Repubblicano per l'anno 1874, Marx wrote an article on, quote, political indifference, end quote, which was published at the end of the year. This article consisted of a critique of the Proudhonian and Bakuninist doctrine according to which the working class should abstain from political action. The result of these principles, proclaimed as, quote, freedom, autonomy, and anarchy, end quote, would be simply the social liquidation of the worker. Marx underlined the necessity of a twofold fight by the working class. First, through economic movements such as coalitions and strikes, and secondly, political demands, i.e. the struggle for political ascendancy, the replacement of the bourgeois dictatorship with the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, accomplished when necessary by means of force and violence. He further composed a, quote, afterword for the second edition of Capital Volume 1, which was published in May by Meissner, and used this opportunity to thank Kugelmann for his valuable questions on a more lucid presentation of the value theory. Marx quoted at length from the Russian economist I. Kaufmann and subscribed to his definition of the dialectic method used in Capital, emphasizing that this method is the direct opposite of Hegel's, for whom the thought process was the demiurge of reality. Quote, for me, end quote, Marx wrote, quote, the world of thought is nothing more than the material world transposed and translated in the human mind, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1, is the function of rational dialectics to comprehend and affirm the existing state of things while recognizing at the same time the negation of that state and its inevitable breakup. Quote, it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement and therefore takes into account its transient nature not less than its momentary existence. It lets nothing impose upon it and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. In the name of the British Federal Council, Marx wrote a circular in answer to the attacks from the Hallis faction, which was attempting to split the council and itself assume leadership. International Herald, January 11th, 1873. Later in February, Marx informed Botha in New York about the Congress which these English secessionists had held and at the time criticized the decision of the New York General Council to expel the entire Euro Federation from the IWA. While the Council might use its power to suspend groups, if secessionists seriously desired to break away from the International, there was no need to expel them. The General Council had only to affirm the fact of their separation from the IWA. This was illustrated by the Hague Congress, whose great achievement, Marx wrote, quote, was to drive the rotten elements to the point where they excluded themselves. That is, they withdrew. The procedure of the General Council threatens to ruin this effect, end quote. February 12, 1873. Marx corresponded regularly with Danielson in St. Petersburg and received a number of works in Russian from his economist friend, who permitted him to undertake a study of Nicholas Sibber on Ricardo's theory of value and capital, Alexei Golovachev, and Alexander Skrabitsky on the peasant question during the reign of Alexander II. While studying the history of communal property, Marx came to the question of its genesis and development as debated in the 1850s by the historian Ivan Belyayev and Boris Chicherin, a philosopher with liberal tendencies, in March 1873. Danielson sent Marx an extensive critical review of the literature on this problem, in particular on the Russian agricultural community, the Obst China, May 22, 1873. Suffering continually from severe headaches and insomnia, Marx decided to go to Manchester in May to consult Engels' friend and personal physician, Dr. Edward Gumpert. He was advised to limit his working hours to 4 a day. During his stay in Manchester, he received a letter from Engels in which the latter disclosed his recent reflections on the dialectics of natural science. Bodies are inseparable from their movement and can be observed and studied only in their dynamic relations to one another. Quote, knowledge of the different forms of movement is the knowledge of bodies. The investigation of these different forms of motion is therefore the chief task of natural science, end quote. May 30th, 1873. On the margins of this letter were notes written by Engels' friend, Karl Schorlemmer, a chemist and a Manchester professor, who recorded his agreement with the points made on the relation of motion to the various branches of natural science. Marx reserved comment until he had an opportunity to discuss the matter with Schorlemmer and Samuel Moore. In the meanwhile, he and Moore, in Manchester, discussed the possibility of determining mathematically the laws of crisis in capitalist production on the basis of tables for the development of prices, discount rates, and other criteria. Marx to Engels, May 31st, 1873. Since Marx's health had made him incapable of pursuing all his old activities with the same intensity, Engels had taken on a great part of their correspondence dealing with the working class movement. Writing in both their names to August Bebel, on the 20th of June, 1873, Engels advised the SDAP on its strategy in dealing with the ADAV and the Lassallians. The SDAP must keep in mind its long-term goal, i.e. to work effectively within the working class, in view of which goal the splinter groups or sects such as the Lassallians were not only unimportant, but could also be detrimental to the real movement should they be incorporated into it. Quote, we must not let ourselves be fooled by the cry for, quote, unity, end quote. Those who use this word the most are the greatest troublemakers, such as the Swiss Jura Bakuninists. Just at the moment, the instigator of all dissension, who cry for nothing more loudly than for unity, end quote. Engels remarked that Hegel was the first who said that, quote, a party proves itself victorious by being able to tolerate divisions, end quote. The proletarian movement would pass through various stages of development, leaving various groups and individuals behind it. Quote, this alone explains why the, quote, solidarity of the proletariat, end quote, manifests itself in actuality through different party groupings everywhere, which fight one another to the death, just as the Christian sects did during the worst persecutions of the Roman Empire, end quote. Engels. Between July and October 1873, Marx continued his studies of agricultural property relations in Russia and read works sent by Danielson and written by such historians and publicists as Belyayev, Kristiana na Rusi, The Peasants in Russia, Vasily I. Sergeyevich V. Skaldin. He continued correcting the Roy translation of Capital, and, with Engels, composed the concluding remarks for a pamphlet on the Alliance, the Bakuninist Alliance, the Social Democratic Alliance, prepared in French by Engels and Lafargue. Engels-Lafargue publication appeared in London and Hamburg at the beginning of September and reported on both Bakunin's activities in Europe and the Alliance conspiracies in Spain, France, Italy, and Switzerland. It contained the text of the infamous, quote, revolutionary catechism, end quote, found in the papers of Nechayev and attributed to Bakunin. In the conclusion, Marx and Engels compared the achievements of the two organizations, the IWA and the Alliance. The latter's, quote, high-sounding phrases on autonomy and free federation and all their war cries against the General Council were nothing more than a mask for their true purpose, the disorganization of the International and thus its subjection to the secret hierarchic autocratic control of the Alliance, end quote. Also included in this pamphlet, entitled simply The Alliance, Les Démocraties Socialistes, and the International Workingmen's Association, was Bakunin's, quote, appeal to the officers of the Russian army, end quote, of 1870. Here Bakunin went so as far as to praise the virtues of secret organization, quote, which find its strength in the disciplined, passionate devotion and self-abnegation of its members and in their obedience to a unique, omniscient committee known to no one, end quote. Bakunin. Here, Marx and Engels decided not to attend the IWA Congress held in Geneva in September and predicted that it would be a fiasco, albeit a quote, inevitable, end quote, fiasco. American England could send no delegates, the latter for financial reasons. The Italians, French, Spanish, and Germans had also refused the invitation, and it therefore became clear that the Congress would assume a purely local character. In view of the present conditions in Europe and this weak demonstration of solidarity, Marx concluded that it was time to let the formal organization of the International more or less dissolve while maintaining the Council to prevent its falling into the hands of, quote, idiots or, quote, adventurers. However, quote, events and the unavoidable development and complication of things will spontaneously assure the rebirth of the International in an improved form. Meanwhile, it will suffice to keep the ties with the most useful elements. It will suffice to keep the ties with the most useful elements in the different countries from slipping out of one's hands, but otherwise not to carry wit about Geneva's local decisions and simply ignore them, end quote. Marx de Zorga, September 27th, 1873. On September 2nd, 1873, Jenny Marx Langay's first child was born. Since the two Lafargue children had died in 1872, little Charles Langay became Marx's sole living grandchild. The same month, Marx sent copies of the new edition of Capital to Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin. Darwin acknowledged the receipt of this volume with a note to the effect that he understood little of the subject, yet he surmised, quote, though your studies have been so different, I believe that we both earnestly desire the extension of knowledge, and that this, in the long run, is sure to add to the happiness of mankind, end quote. Charles Darwin, October 1st, 1873. Marx and his daughter Eleanor traveled to Harrogate on November 24th, 1873, where they spent 3 weeks drinking the waters. Marx, who was suffering from chronic cephalitis, was examined by Dr. Gumpert in Manchester and warned that he risked an apoplectic attack. Gumpert forbade him to work and recommended long and vigorous walks at the seaside. Despite these efforts at treatment, Marx's bout of furunculosis continued after his return to London. Kugelmann wrote to Marx on December 28, 1873, reporting that Capital had recently been reviewed in the journal Im Neuen Reich, and that through Michel he had learned that there would probably be no danger of police persecution if Marx returned to Germany to live, provided he refrained from political demonstrations. New section. 1874. Marx resumed his studies for Capital and the readings in Russian. He was particularly absorbed in the problems of the agricultural sector for Book 3, including plant physiology and the theory of chemical fertilizers. He also examined in detail the official publications of the English government, blue books, on recent economic problems and theory. In March 1874, Marx received a visit from Lapetin, who passed on to him a series of articles by Sibber on, quote, Marx's economic theory, end quote. During this month, Marx read Bakunin's Gasudarstvenost I Anarchia, Statehood and Anarchy, published in 1873 in Geneva, and excerpted from it while making extensive commentaries on selected passages. He was especially interested in Bakunin's views on the, quote, anarchist, end quote, Slav peoples as opposed to the Germans who be termed, quote, etatist, which I guess is status. Bakunin wrote that, quote, the Germans seek their life and freedom within the state. For the Slavs, the state is a grave. They seek their emancipation outside the state, not only by fighting against the German state, but by an all-embracing popular revolt against every state through social revolution, end quote. Bakunin. Bakunin attributed to Marx the notion of a, quote, people state, end quote, i.e. a hierarchical government controlled by a small intellectual elite which imposed its will on the masses. Bakunin also dealt with the, quote, national German hatred of Russia, with Pan-Slavism, the Polish question, and the Russo-German alliance. Bakunin made a vicious personal attack against Marx and the, quote, Marxist, end quote, calling Marx a, quote, Hebrew, who, quote, unites in himself, one might say, all the virtues and all the defects of this talented race, ... extraordinarily ambitious and vain, quarrelsome, intolerant, and as absolute as Jehovah, ... vengeful to the point of madness, end quote. Bakunin, and capable of the basest intrigues to augment his own power, influence, or position. Marx remarked that Bakunin, quote, would like the European social revolution, whose economic basis is capitalist production, to take place at the level of the Russian or Slavic agrarian peoples and pastoral tribes and not surpass this level, ... Not the economic conditions, but the will is the basis of his social revolution, end quote. I guess that's part of the reason why, like, ultra-voluntarist, like, forms of Marxism, say, like, I don't know, Maoism or, like, Guevaraism or something like that, are often, like, called or labeled similar to anarchism, which I think is a mistake. But I think even like Che Guevara was called, like, the Bakunin of Latin America or something. I believe that's the case. I might be making that up, so forgive me if I am, but I think that was a name people gave him. Anyway, Marx wrote in his notes that radical social revolution is possible, quote, only where the industrial proletariat under capitalist production has assumed a significant position in the masses, end quote. To be victorious, a social revolution must be able to accomplish as much for the modern peasantry as the French Revolution did for the peasants in its time. Marx countered Bakunin's attack on the label, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, as applied to Marx's writings, saying that he had never used this term, quote, except in contrast to utopic socialism, end quote, such as that of Bakunin and Proudhon, who put unrealistic fantasies into people's heads, quote, instead of limiting itself to the science which recognizes the self-produced social movement of the people, end quote. Marx. In April and May 1874, Marx again spent 3 weeks at the seaside in Ramsgate. Dr. Gumpert, who Marx visited in Manchester, advised him to take the waters at Carlsbad. After returning to London on the 5th of May, he went back to work on the French translation of Capital and finished all but the last 3 installments before leaving again for a short stay at Ryde on the Isle of Wight with his wife Jenny. In July and June 1874, news came from Germany that sympathy for Eugen Düring was steadily increasing within the ranks of the Social Democrats. Disturbed by this news, Marx and Engels wrote to Liebknecht, Bloss, and Heppner to warn of the dangers inherent in this tendency, distancing themselves from Düring's views as expressed in his Kritische Geschichte der Nationalökonomie und des Sozialismus of 1871. Toward the end of their stay at Ryde, the Marxes were informed of the sudden death of little Charles Longuet, a blow which shook them both profoundly. Marx confided in Kugelmann that, quote, in this respect I am not as stoic as in others, and family suffering always hit me very hard. The more one is cut off from the external world, as I am, the more one is emotionally involved in one's own most intimate circle." End quote. Marx, August 4th, 1874. In letters to both Kugelmann and Zorga, Marx reported on the present standing of the proletarian movement in Europe and America. In particular, Marx told Zorga that the American movement, despite political and economic handicaps, seemed to be progressing. Its greatest obstacle, he noted, was, quote, "the professional politician who immediately falsifies every new movement and seeks to transform it into a new, quote, commercial enterprise," end quote. March 18th, 1874. In England, the International was practically dead, Marx wrote to Zorga, and the only action going on was among the agricultural workers, while the industrial proletariat was trying to rid itself of its leaders. He regretted that they had not been elected to Parliament, which would have been the, quote, surest way to get rid of the pack, end quote. Europe seemed heading for a general war, he added, quote, "We must pass through that before thinking about any decisive external effectiveness of the European working class," end quote. August 4th, 1874. Having now decided to take the trip to Carlsbad, Marx applied once again for British citizenship, which would facilitate his passage into Austrian territory without danger of arrest. August 1st, 1874. His demand was turned down on August 29th for a reason not communicated to the applicant, viz. That, quote, "this man was not loyal to his king," end quote. Shortly before his own departure, Marx accompanied his daughter Jenny to Eastbourne, where she joined Engels and his wife for a stay at the seaside and a tour of the island of Jersey. A letter which Marx wrote to his daughter to Eastbourne reveals how much he was touched by the loss of his grandchild. Quote, "The house is dead now, since the little angel no longer fills it with life. I miss him at every step. It hurts me so to think of him, and yet how can one banish from one's mind the thought of such a sweet, fine little fellow? But I do hope, my child, that to please your old father you are keeping up your courage," end quote. August 14th, 1874. Accompanied by Eleanor, who had recently suffered a nervous breakdown, Marx left for Carlsbad on August 19th. There, father and daughter diligently followed their doctor's orders, taking the waters at this famous mineral spa. Eleanor reported to her sister Jenny on September 5th, 1874, I think Papa is better, and the waters are sure to have a good effect. We are very exact indeed in all our duties. Fancy Papa being ready dressed and at the, quote, brunnen," end quote, spring, by 6 o'clock, frequently still earlier. We take long walks and altogether get on very well here," end quote. Quoted in Suzuki, The Life of Eleanor Marx. They were in the company of the Kugelmanns and a number of the latter's friends, mostly doctors of medicine like Kugelmann. Marx grew irritable from the effects of the strenuous treatment and was soon unable to tolerate the Philistine milieu in which he found himself, even less the pedantic ways of his constant companion, Dr. Kugelmann. Their friendship suddenly grew very distant as Marx took issue with Kugelmann's attitude towards his wife. To Engels he wrote that, quote, "This arch pedantic, bourgeois, narrow-minded Philistine deludes himself, namely in imagining that his wife is unable to understand, to comprehend his Faust-like nature. Full of higher Weltanschauung, he torments the little lady in a most abominable fashion, although actually she is superior to him in every way," end quote. September 18th, 1874. However, he reported spending pleasant hours in the company of Frau Kugelmann's brother, Max Oppenheim of Prague, who invited Marx to visit him at his home on the return trip. While Marx was in Carlsbad, the 7th Annual International Congress of the IWA was held in Brussels, September 7th to 13th. There was an open confrontation between the anarchist, quote, "anti-authoritarian," end quote, delegates from Belgium, Spain, and the Euro, and standing alone as partisans of political engagement, Icarius and 2 German delegates. Zorga, who did not attend the Congress and had submitted his resignation as Secretary General of the Council, vainly attempted to have the General Council adjourned indefinitely. Replying to Zorga's report in Marx's absence, Engels supported Zorga's step and added that it marked the end of the old International, quote, "and this is good. It belonged to the period of the Second Empire, when the oppression everywhere in Europe prescribed unity and abstention from all internal polemics to the newly reawakening workers' movement," end quote. September 12th and 17th, 1874. For 10 years, the IWA had served the development of the European working class. Its old form had now grown obsolete, for the movement had intensified both in depth and in breadth. Engels concluded, quote, "I think the next international, after Marx's writings have been at work for some years, will be directly communist and will openly proclaim our principles." End quote. Eleanor and her father left Carlsbad on September 21st, 1874, traveling via Dresden and Leipzig, where they met Liebknecht, Bloss, and other representatives of the SDAP. Liebknecht proposed to Marx to reprint his Revelations on the Communist Trial in Cologne in the SDAP organ Volksstaat, October 1874 to January 1875. He was also interested in bringing out new editions of the Misere and the Holy Family. Passing then to Berlin, they visited Jenny Marx's brother Edgar von Westphalen, and thereafter to Hamburg, where Marx spoke with Meissner and with other members of the SDAP. On the 8th of November, an outsider, August Glib, informed Marx and Engels of a pending rapprochement between the SDAP and the Lassallean ADAV. A conference had been convened at which it was planned to adopt the basic elements of the IWA program into their statutes and strike out the, quote, immediate demands, end quote, formulated in the Eisenach program. At the close of the year, Marx returned to his Russian studies, reading N.G. Chernyshevsky's work, Konvignak and Pisma, bez adresa, letter without address. New section, 1875. For the republication of the Revelations in the Volksstaat, Marx wrote a quote afterward, dated January 8, 1875, in which he reviewed the events of 1851 to 52 in light of 2 decades of experience with the working class movement. Now he saw them as part of the general atmosphere of frustration which followed in the wake of the 1848 defeats. In part, both the comportment of Willich and Schapper and the bitterness of Marx's own attack on these, quote, involuntary accomplices of our common enemy, end quote, could be explained by their thwarted revolutionary energies. The principles for which they had all fought in those days had in the meanwhile been triumphant in the statutes of the IWA. The Cologne trial had thus become for Marx a symbol of the state's utter impotence to check or restrain the development of the working class movement. Quote, society, he concluded, quote, will not reach its equilibrium until it revolves around the sun of labor, end quote. With Engels, Marx participated on January 23, 1875, in a meeting held in commemoration of the Polish uprisings of 1863 to 64. Marx addressed the audience on the relations of the working class to Poland and explained the proletarian interest and explained the proletarian interest in and sympathy for the Polish cause as having 3 sources: their natural sympathy for oppressed peoples, Poland's specific geographic, military, and historic position as buffer between the great powers of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and most importantly, the fact that, quote, Poland is not only the sole Slavic race, but also the only European people which has fought and is still fighting as a cosmopolitan soldier of the Revolution. End quote. Poland, who shed its blood in the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and all other European revolts, including the recent Commune, had therefore but one true ally in Europe, the party of the working class. In January 1875, Marx finished the last corrections and revisions for the French edition of Capital. On the 28th of April 1875, he wrote an, quote, epilogue, which followed the last installment in mid-May 1875. Marx explained that certain changes had been made in the form of the argumentation and addition of material in order to make it more intelligible to the French reader. Therefore, he observed, quote, whatever the literary defects of this French edition may be, it possesses a scientific value independent of the original and should be consulted even by readers familiar with German, end quote. At the beginning of the year, Marx passed on to Engels a publication by Peter Tkachev entitled An Open Letter to Mr. Friedrich Engels, author of the articles on emigrant literature, remarking that Engels should, quote, lash into it in a light-hearted manner, end quote. In reply to Tkachev, Engels then included in his series on, quote, immigrant literature, end quote, which appeared in Der Volksstaat, a number of articles subtitled, quote, Social Problems in Russia, end quote, April 16th to 21st, 1875. This material was later reprinted as a pamphlet and accompanied by introductory remarks. Engels refuted Tkachev's contention that Russia would more easily and more quickly produce a social revolution than the West European countries. In order to have a proletarian victory, Engels argued, there must not only be a proletariat, but also a bourgeoisie which has developed the productive forces to an extent that will permit class differences to be eliminated henceforth. Therefore, for Tkachev to say that this revolution would be more easily accomplished in Russia, quote, only proves that he still has to learn the ABCs of socialism, end quote. The proposed union of the Eisenach Socialists and the Lassallean Party became imminent. A program was drafted and sent to Marx and Engels for their comments. Engels wrote in both their names to Babel, and sharply criticized this, quote, weak and insipid, end quote, text. Should it be accepted, Engels remarked, they would be unable to support the party and moreover would be forced to consider seriously taking a public stand against it. In addition to the faulty structure it placed upon the phrasing in the IWA statutes, the program lacked any mention of the real proletarian organization in trade unions and failed to include the, quote, first condition of all freedom, that all functionaries be responsible for all their official actions to every citizen before the ordinary courts and according to normal law, end quote. March 18th to 28th, 1875. Engels felt that on the whole, this program was a step backwards from the Eisenach platform, since it incorporated Lassallean, quote, socialist measures, and would certainly lead to a rift in the party within a year. On May 5th, 1875, Marx wrote his own critique of the program in a letter addressed to Wilhelm Brache, a leading member of the SDAP and Reichstag deputy. Point for point, he analyzed the new program known as the Gotha program, and within the framework of his critique developed several important aspects of his views on the future communist social organization. He stressed, for example, the international scope of the economic struggle carried on by the working class. Its goal, not a more, quote, equitable distribution of the products of labor, but a fundamental change in the production relations themselves. From this point, Marx proceeded to a brief discussion of the problem of distribution in an emergent communist society, i.e. in one which has introduced common ownership of the means of production but not yet developed the full potential of the system. What the individual producer gives society in one form, he receives from it in another. Quote, right is here equality according to equal standard labor, yet it is inequality in respect of the actual contents of what the individual receives, since human productive capacity varies greatly. Marx concludes that, quote, right by its very nature can only consist in the application of an equal standard, but unequal individuals, and they would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are only measurable by an equal standard insofar as they are brought under an equal point of view, are taken from one definite side only, ... end quote. Right should therefore be unequal instead of equal. This difficulty of the first phase of communist social development would, however, be overcome after the division of labor and antithesis between intellectual and manual labor had disappeared, after labor had been transformed from a means of life to the, quote, prime necessity of life, end quote. Only when the individual is finally permitted a, quote, all-round development, end quote, of his capacities, increasing society's productive force in correspondence with his own development, quote, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be completely superseded, and may society inscribe on its banner, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, end quote. In his critique of the Gotha conception of a, quote, free state, Marx pointed out that the state is rooted in bourgeois society and production relations. The transformation of society into communist society will also affect the state, and during the transitional period, the political form will necessitate, quote, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The class struggle leading to this dictatorship would be fought in the arena of the democratic republic, the last form of state under bourgeois production relations. Quite in contrast to Marx's picture of the future society, the program of the SDAP was, quote, tainted through and through by the servile belief in the state of Lassalle's sect, or, what is no better, by democratic miracle faith, ... equally remote from socialism, end quote. In the last half of the year, 1875, Marx frequently met Lavrov and exchanged views on books and on world events. In a postscript to one of their conversations on Traube's experiments in creating artificial cells, Marx wrote to Lavrov that was a great and most appropriately timed step. Helmholtz and others were propagating the doctrine whereby the nuclei of terrestrial life were said to have been created by meteors. Quote, I detest such explanations that solve a problem by banishing it into another sphere, end quote. Marx concluded. June 18th, 1875. Again, from August 15th to September 11th, 1875, Marx was in Carlsbad to take the waters. He returned via Prague, where he paid a short visit to Max Oppenheim. The stay seemed to have done him much good, for as Engels wrote to Braque on October 11th, 1875, he returned, quote, completely changed, full of energy, flesh, alert, and healthy, and can now soon return seriously to work, end quote. The Gotha program, Engels remarked in the same letter, was enjoying a much better fate than it deserved. Quote, working men and bourgeois and petit bourgeois alike read into it what should be there but isn't, and no one from either side has come to the idea of publicly examining one of those wonderful sentences as to its real contents. This situation has enabled us to keep silent about it, end quote. October 11th, 1875. Both before and after his sojourn in Carlsbad, Marx spent most of his reading and study time on works connected with Russia, her economic and agricultural situation. He read Alexander Engelhardt on agricultural problems and agrochemistry, Yuri Samarin and Theodore Dmitriev on revolutionary conservatism, Kavalin and Alexander Koshelev, and began a study of statistics and documents on the fiscal problems in Russia. After having received 10 volumes of reports from the Russian Fiscal Commission of 1872 through Danielson, invited by Lavrov to attend the December 4th, 1875 meeting on Poland organized by Valery Wrublewski, Marx was forced to refuse because of his health. However, Marx wrote Lavrov that his participation would not have added anything new to the views he had already expressed on Poland's situation, quote, namely that Poland's emancipation is one of the preconditions for the emancipation of the working class in Europe. The new conspiracies of the Holy Alliance are a renewed proof of this, end quote. December 3rd, 1875. Sometime in the course of this year, Marx had worked out a detailed mathematical scheme for the relation of surplus value to profit, as presented in the third book of Capital. In mid-December 1875, Marx wrote to Dietzken that once he had finished with, quote, the economics, end quote, he tended to write on the subject of dialectics. New section, 1876. Let me get a drink here. For the most part, Marx's readings in this year, 1876, and they were considerable, centered around the question of agriculture, primitive communal property relations, and Russian economic relations. In March, he read and excerpted from works on physiology by Johannes Ranke and M.J. Schleiden. In May, G.L. Maurer on the history of the Mark and Socage farms. I don't know what the hell that means. Socage farms. See readings for 1868 as well. Marx made a thorough study of Russian relations of land ownership and the money market. Of Haxthausen's book on the rural constitution in Russia, took up monographs on Russian history, and finally extended his research on primitive communal property relations to Spain and the Slav peoples. Hansen, Demelich, Utis Henovich, and Cardenas. Examining the related field of legal relations, Marx read works on common law, comparative French, and Hindu law. In April, he read from two English authors, Carlyle, Oliver Cromwell's Letters and Speeches, and Yeats, The Natural History of the Raw Material of Commerce. For Capital, he wrote sections dealing with differential rent, and rent as the simple interest on capital incorporated into land. He was invited to speak at a celebration on February 7, 1876, honoring the founding of the London Working Men's Educational Society. The roots of this movement, which the society represented, began with the League of the Just and the Communist League. Marx informed his audience, and its newest offshoot was the German Social Democratic Party. In order to extend his study of agricultural relations, property relations in general, and credit to further countries, Marx requested Zorga to send him a recent catalog of books published since 1873 on these topics so that he might procure himself the relevant American literature. He also requested Frenkel in Budapest to send him literature. Frenkel reported to Marx that he had been arrested in Vienna for participation in the Paris Commune and was soon to stand trial. In the statement he had given to the examining judge, Frenkel had insisted that for his actions during the Commune he was responsible only to history and not to a court of law. Moreover, the Commune government had been a legitimate government elected by popular mandate. March 28, 1876. On May 10, 1876, Marx became the grandfather of a little boy, Jean Longuet, son of his daughter, Jenny, and the first of his grandchildren who had lived to reach maturity. While Engels was spending a few days at Ramsgate, he corresponded with Marx on the problem of Eugen Düring's growing influence among the German Social Democrats. Marx suggested that Düring's work be submitted to a rigorous critical examination. Engels agreed to take on this task and began collecting material on Düring, whose writing he termed, quote, high-sounding banalities, nothing more, in between complete nonsense, but everything arranged with a certain talent for his public, end quote. July 25, 1876. Bakunin's death on July 1, 1876, occasioned numerous memorials in European papers, one of which Marx commented in a letter to Engels, July 26, portrayed Bakunin as the, quote, giant, as the, quote, giant, end quote, of the revolution, end quote. The Alliance used this tragic event as the occasion for a reconciliation with the SDAP. Liebknecht declared himself favorably disposed to such a development. On August 15, 1876, Marx again arrived in Carlsbad in the company of his daughter Eleanor. Their journey by train via Cologne and Nuremberg had been all but uneventful, for the hotels were crowded with music lovers and Wagner fans headed for the Bayreuth Festival, and so the two travelers found lodging in neither Nuremberg nor Weiden, where they were formerly obliged to spend the night on the benches of the railway station. Marx wrote his daughter Jenny about the phenomenal attraction of Wagner for the German public. Quote, everywhere you are pestered about the question, what do you think of Wagner? Very characteristic of the neo-German Prussian Reichs musician. He and his spouse, the one who was separated from Bülow, the cuckold Bülow, and their common father-in-law Liszt, are living together. All four, in perfect harmony, they embrace, kiss, and adore one another and thoroughly enjoy themselves. If, apart from that, you keep in mind that Liszt is a Roman monk and Madame Wagner, is the, quote, natural, end quote, daughter of Madame de Agout, Daniel Stern, then you could not imagine a better libretto for Offenbach than this family group with its patriarchal relations, end quote. End of August/September 1876. While in Carlsbad, Marx received from Lavrov his recent work on the state element in future society, which he promised to read at a later date, since his treatment at the waters, long walks in the environs of the city, and conversations with new friends consumed his day from morning to evening. He became acquainted with the Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz, with whom he discussed the defects of Russian Tsarism. On their return home, Marx and his daughter stopped over in Prague for a visit with Oppenheim, and then in Kreuznach, where Marx recounted to Eleanor stories from the early days of his marriage. After returning to London on September 23, 1876, Marx concerned himself with finding a publisher for a German edition of Prosper Lysagore's work, quote, "the first authentic history of the Commune," end quote, presently being brought out by a Brussels publisher. Marx suggested to Wilhelm Brache in a letter of September 23, 1876, that the German translation be started as soon as possible. Where is it? Marx suggested to Wilhelm Brache in a letter of September 23, 1876, that the German translation be started as soon as possible, and offered to review and correct the translation himself. The book was important, he assured Brache, not only for the party but for the German reading public in general. During Marx's absence, the Revue du Monde had published a critique of Capital, which for Marx was exemplary proof of the, quote, idiocy of our bourgeois, quote, thinkers, end quote, end quote. The author, Émile de Lavallee, was, quote, naive enough to admit that once one recognized the doctrines of Adam Smith or Ricardo, or even, quote, Aribe Dictu, those of Carre and Bastiat, there is no way of avoiding the revolutionary conclusions of, quote, Capital, end quote, to Lavrov, October 7, 1876. With the SDAP now considering the offer of brotherhood tendered by the Geneva anarchists, Marx wrote to warn Liebknecht that these, quote, incorrigible intrigants, end quote, who had systematically worked towards the dissolution of the IWA, would imagine that they could work their way back into the movement in order to continue their destructive role. Apart from party affairs, Marx commented on European politics and emphasized that the SDAP should take a critical stand against Bismarck's foreign policy. The only active European country seemed to be Russia, and the source of this stagnation was, quote, Bismarck's official coquetry with Russia, end quote, which paralyzed the whole continent, disarmed Germany, and, quote, damned the latter to the ignominious role it is presently playing, a role which is truly, quote, Europe's disgrace, end quote, October 7th, 1876. In England, Marx reported, a new political constellation was in ascendancy. Gladstone and Russell were in retreat, and the enlightened working-class elements had called a protest meeting against the pro-pan-Slavic trends within their own ranks. Liebknecht was called upon to treat these themes in his articles for the Volksstaat, to expose the, quote, wretchedness of the traditional bourgeois press in Germany, which, although allegedly anti-Russian, never dared criticize the foreign policy of Bismarck, end quote. Liebknecht responded to these suggestions with a series of polemical articles on European politics and Russia. Marx also furnished the Urquhartist Charles D. Collett with the information on Gladstone's pro-Russian politics, which Collett used in preparing a series for the Diplomatic Review in early November 1876. New section, 1877. At the beginning of the year, Marx studied the Eastern question and Gladstone's role in the current Russo-Turkish conflict. In January 1877, Marx read various official documents and examined statistics pertinent to Britain's relations with the East. He also made excerpts from Sir Adolf Slade's book, Turkey and the Crimean War, and finally prepared several articles attacking Gladstone's pro-Russian foreign policy. Through the mediation of Maltman Berry, journalist for a conservative British paper and former member of the IWA General Council, Marx published these articles anonymously in widely read conservative London news organs. Quote, Mr. Gladstone and the Russian Intrigue appeared on February 3, 1877, in the Whitehall Review, and was later reprinted in the Morning News and other government journals. The second article, Mr. Gladstone, was published on March 3, 1877, in Vanity Fair. On March 10, 1877, in the same paper, quote, The Agitator Unmasked appeared. Marx exposed, among other things, Gladstone's relations with the, quote, unofficial, end quote, agent of the Russian diplomatic mission in London, Novikov, Jenny Marx reported to Zorga on January 20th, 1877, that her husband was very absorbed in these studies and writing and, quote, highly elated about the firm, honorable stand taken by Mahomet's sons against all the Christian humbugs and hypocritical atrocity mongers. He was convinced that, whatever the outcome of the actual conflict, revolution would break out in Russia itself. See Marx to Dr. Freund, January 21st, 1877. Marx was also pleased about the recent electoral victory of the German Social Democrats, which, quote, not only gave our highly esteemed German Philistines a rather brutal shock, but the ruling classes in England and France as well, end quote. To F. Fleckless, January 21st, 1877. Marx received a letter from his Carlsbad acquaintance, Gretz, who thanked him for the copies of his works and said that he especially enjoyed the Civil War in France. Quote, Paris all truth, Versailles all lies. When a man like you pronounces these words of damnation, it is as if the verdict had been delivered as history's last judge, end quote. February 1st, 1877. From his own writings, Gretz suggested that Marx would be interested in reading about Solomon, a, quote, hard realist, end quote, who preferred this world to the hereafter and, quote, preached the rehabilitation of the flesh, end quote. Marx was approached by a young Irish parliamentarian, Case O'Clery, who wished to collect information on police and legal persecutions in contemporary Russia. O'Clery wished to present a resolution whereby Russia would be required to make certain reforms in its own system before demanding that they be introduced in Turkey. Marx communicated this request to Lavrov, who provided an article with the pertinent information. Marx to Lavrov, March 16, 1877. Shortly before the actual declaration of war between Turkey and Russia, Marx conjectured in a letter to Braca that Russia and Prussia entertained a secret agreement which permitted the former to advance its troops through Romania without inciting the opposition of the Western powers. He noted that, quote, the working class pays much too little attention to the Eastern question and forgets that the ministerial policies wantonly play with life and the money of the people, end quote. April 21st, 1877. By contrast, sufficient public opposition could put a stop to the Prussian machinations, which most probably planned for another division of Poland or even a war on the side of the Tsar. For health reasons, Marx refused an offer to collaborate on a new journal to be edited by Franz Vida in Switzerland. He explained to Engels that he would very much like to see a, quote, truly scientific socialist journal, end quote, started up to provide a forum for critique and rebuttal, for theoretical discussion, and to, quote, expose the absolute ignorance of the professors and lecturers, and at the same time help enlighten the minds of the general readers, working men and bourgeois alike, end quote. July 18th, 1877. However, he seriously doubted whether Vida's publication would permit and encourage rigorous theoretical discussion and the, quote, ruthlessness, end quote, which he held to be the first condition of all critique. More probably, it would turn out to be, quote, bogus scientific, end quote. Commenting on the news of a strike movement in America, Marx wrote to Engels that this rebellion, although it would be eventually defeated, might nevertheless promote the constitution of a, quote, serious working men's party, end quote, there. July 25th, 1877. The SDAP published a number of articles in its journal Vorwärts, formerly Volksstaat, which depreciated the parliamentary struggle in France for a democratic order. Marx and Engels were roused to oppose this stand on the question of monarchy versus bourgeois democracy energetically. Writing to Liebknecht on July 2nd, Engels pointed out that essential to France's development was the establishment of the working men's movement under a bourgeois republican regime and not a monarchy. He argued that, moreover, the, quote, meaningless dispute about the form of the state, end quote, should cease and the republican state exposed as what it really is, quote, the classic form of bourgeois rule and simultaneously the source of its own dissolution, end quote. Engels was now occupied with his articles against Düring, which were sent to Liebknecht for publication in Vorwärts, 1877 to 1878. At the beginning of August 1877, Marx finished writing a chapter for Engels dealing with Düring's views on political economy. Then, for the chapter on socialism, he began investigating various writings by Robert Owen, including The Revolution in the Mind and Practice of the Human Race, which in Marx's words contained a resume of Owen's entire doctrine. He sent Engels Quinet's Tabelle économique, quote, in view of the date of its publication, one of the most genial generalizations produced by political economy, end quote, to Engels, August 8, 1877, and advised him to use it primarily for his own orientation and, for textual clarity, to explain the simple general movements of capital in his own words. Hold on a second. Marx interrupted his studies in August and September for a lengthy stay in the Ahr Valley in Germany with his wife and Eleanor. There, all three took the waters and enjoyed the tranquility of a, quote, fortunate, end quote, region which had not yet been infected by modern means of transport. Marx to Engels, October 17, 1877. Following this treatment, they spent 2 weeks in the Black Forest and returned to London on September 27, 1877. Marx now recommended his study of Owen's writings, The Crisis. Marx now recommenced his study of Owen's writings, The Crisis, 1832 to 1834, A New View of Society, 1813 to 1814, Proposed Arrangements for the Distressed Working Class, 1819. Marx also continued with his Russian studies, reading and excerpting from works by the Russian economist and statistician I. Kaufman. His health permitting, he was investigating Russian conditions on the basis of official and unofficial sources, and was convinced, he wrote to Zorga, the revolution was pending in Russia. Quote, all levels of Russian society are now caught in a process of complete economic, moral, and intellectual decomposition. This time the revolution is going to start in the East, hitherto the unassailed bulwark of the counter-revolution and its reserve army, end quote. September 27th, 1877. After various delays in finding a translator for the German edition of Lesagres' Histoire de la Commune de 1871, Marx rejected an unsatisfactory translation prepared by Isolde Kurtz and suggested to Braque that he turn the text over to Wilhelm Bloss, one of the Vorwärts editors, for completion and revision. In the same letter, he criticized the unsatisfactory journalism of the German socialists, especially since the SDAP's reconciliation with the Lassallians and the followers of Düring, and referred to the articles in Vorwärts as, quote, juvenile schoolbook exercises, end quote. October 23, 1877. Sometime in November 1877, Marx rewrote the first chapter of Book 2 of Capital, for which he had drafted two chapters, Chapter 19 and Chapter 20, about 70 pages. But sometime in the spring. He requested new material from Zorga, a, quote, blue book, end quote, on the Pennsylvania miners, letter to Zorga, October 19, 1877, and from Sigmund Schott, November 3, 1877. To Schott, he explained the procedure which had been followed in writing Capital. Quote, confidently speaking, I in fact began, quote, Capital in just the reverse, starting with the third, the historic part, of the order in which it is presented to the public, except that the first volume, the one begun last, was immediately prepared for publication, while the other two remained in that primitive state characteristic of all research at the outset, end quote. November 3rd, 1877. Marx corresponded with Bloss on the translation of Lesagres' book. In a letter of November 10th, he remarked that both he and Engels were utterly indifferent to popularity. During the International, he had avoided all attempts to push him into the public eye. As for the so frequently heard accusation of, quote, authoritarianism, end quote, Marx said that he had not joined the Communist League until the passages favorable to the, quote, cult of authority, end quote, had been removed from the statutes. Sometime in November, he prepared a letter to the editor of a Russian journal, Otechestvenia Sapisky, refuting the views presented there by N.K. Mikhailovsky. Marx disputed Mikhailovsky's assertion that his theory of capital was a, quote, universal philosophical theory of the general course of development imposed on all peoples, whatever their historic circumstances, end quote. In other words, he made no claim to have developed a philosophical theory of general social development whose chief virtue was superhistoricity. According to Mikhailovsky, Marx also propagated the theory that Russia, in order to attain socialism, must abolish the system of rural communal property and develop along the lines of West European capitalism. In his unpublished reply, Marx wrote that his broad studies on Russia had led him to conclude the contrary. If Russia continued the present course of capitalist development embarked upon in 1861, it would lose, quote, the best chance history has ever offered to people, end quote, to avoid the disastrous vicissitudes of capitalist society. This new trend of Russian economic progress was destined to transform its peasantry into proletariat, and, quote, then, once dragged into the turmoil of capitalist economy, it will have to endure the inexorable laws of this system in the same way as the other profane peoples, end quote. Marx. November marked the founding in France of Jules Gued's newspaper of, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, Égalité, which declared support for the Republican parliamentary movement and its belief that, quote, the natural and scientific evolution of humanity is inevitably leading it to the collective appropriation of the land and of the instruments of production, end quote. November 18th, 1877. New section, 1878. In this year, Marx again consumed a considerable amount of reading material. The focal point of his interest was material pertinent to the third book of Capital. On money and banking, he read John P. Gassiot's Monetary Panics and Their Remedies, published 1869, Charles Mann's Paper Money, The Root of All Evil, published in 1872, A. Walker's The National Currency and the Money Problem, published in 1876. Along with Pietro Rota and I. Kaufmann, he also delved into works on the Russian peasant communes, agronomy and geology, James F. W. Johnston, Johann Gottlieb Koppa, and Joseph Beata Ukes for the latter two subjects, and read two books sent to him personally by their authors, John R. Dawkins, The Antiquity of Man, published 1877, and John K. Ingram's The Present Position and Prospect of Political Economy, 1878. Mathematics was reintroduced into Marx's study program sometime this year. He continued his efforts in algebra and higher mathematics until shortly before his death, and filled numerous notebooks with remarks and outlines of mathematical theory. Towards the end of this year, he read works by Leibniz and Descartes on natural science and mathematics. With the Eastern question again a central issue in European politics, Marx was afforded a chance to comment on Russia's role in the East. Requested by Liebknecht to provide information for articles on the Russo-Turkish conflict, Marx produced two lengthy letters on the reasons for this crisis and for its outcome, explaining moreover his own standpoint as follows. 1. After considerable study, he was convinced that in Turkey, the peasantry and therefore the mass of the population was, quote, the most able and morally the most representative of the European peasantry, end quote. 2. A Russian defeat would have accelerated social revolution in that country and brought change to all Europe. That the Turks were not triumphant was due both to England's and Austria's betrayal and to the Turks' own failure to produce a revolution at Constantinople. Quote, a people which does not know how to strike a revolutionary blow at such moments of the most acute crisis is lost, end quote. Russia and Prussia had been in league in this war, with Prussian aid in checking Austria. Russia was able to maneuver, and only thanks to Russian support was the Bismarck regime maintained in power. Quote, Russia's defeat, revolution in Russia, would sound the death knell for Prussia, end quote. Marx concluded. However, seen in a wider perspective, Austria and Turkey's collapse meant that the old order of post-Napoleonic Europe was crumbling. The breakdown would continue to manifest itself in local and then in continental wars, which, quote, will accelerate the social crisis, and with it the defeat of all these phony, sword-brandishing powers, end quote. February 4th, 1878. In his second letter, both were later published as an appendix to Liebknecht's pamphlet, zur orientalischen Frage oder soll Europa kosakisch werden? On the Eastern question, or should Europe turn Cossack? March 1878. Marx commented on the positive results of the Russian victory, i.e. it caused a split in the ranks of England's Liberal Party. Through the corruption of the trade union leaders and professional agitators, the working class had gradually been assimilated in this party. Now a Russian victory exposed the true leanings of the liberal leaders and ended the paralysis of the proletariat in England. February 11th, 1878. After an attempt on the life of the Prussian Emperor Wilhelm I in May 1878, reprisals were taken against the Social Democrats, although the SDAP was in no way involved in the act. One of Bismarck's agents in this anti-socialist campaign was Lothar Bucher, a former member of the International Workingmen's Association. Marx challenged Bucher in a letter to the Daily News on June 12, 1878, to avow publicly that the goals and teachings of the working class movement had nothing to do with such acts of political vengeance. The panic created around this incident and the measures against the SDAP, he added, served the sole purpose of facilitating Bismarck's course. Marx's attention was caught by an article entitled, quote, The History of the International Workingmen's Association, end quote, with a former General Council member, George Howe, had written for the London Journal, The 19th Century. However, Howe claimed to be telling the story of the rise and fall of the IWA and Marx's role in it, and maintained, for example, that Marx had sown seeds of dissension by introducing from the outset, quote, religious ideas, end quote, into the International. In an article which appeared on August 4th, 1877, in the Secular Chronicle, Marx replied to Howe with his own view of the International's merits and achievements, quote, not with a well-filled treasury, but with its intellectual force and selfless energy, end quote, had the IWA won a worldwide reputation and historical distinction. Although formally disbanded, the working class movement continued to make headway in all of Europe and was entering a higher phase of development, its goals in part achieved. In the future, however, quote, the Workingmen's International must still undergo many changes before the last chapter of its history is written, end quote. In October 1878, Marx prepared an exposé of Howe's IWA history and Franz Mehring's Die Deutsche Sozialdemokratie for a book by the English clergyman Moritz Kaufmann on utopias or schemes of social improvement from Sir Thomas More to Karl Marx. He also provided Maltman Berry with information on German socialism, which Berry used in preparing various lectures and articles. August 1878. Finally, he corresponded with another English journalist, John Stuart Glennie, who was planning a New Year's organ and wanted material on socialism as one of the political powers of the future. July to August 1878. The first edition of Engels' Anti-Düring appeared in Leipzig on July 8, 1878. About July 8, 1878. Broadly conceived, this work gave a critique of Düring's philosophical thought, his political economy, and socialism from what Engels held to be the Marxian standpoint. He defined this standpoint in the introduction, saying that its two great pillars were Marx's, quote, discoveries, which, quote, transformed socialism into science, end quote. First, the, quote, materialist conception of history, end quote, and secondly, quote, the revelation of the secret of capitalist production through surplus value, end quote. As he explained further in the chapter devoted to capital and surplus value, Marx's, quote, discovery of the function of surplus value, quote, laid bare the mechanism of present-day capitalist modes of production, exposed the nucleus around which the entire modern social order had crystallized. Engels gave a similar presentation of Marxian theory in a biographical article which he wrote on Marx for the Braunschweig Volkskalender of 1878. Marx's daughter Jenny was again delivered of his son on July 4th, 1878. Like four other Marx grandchildren before him, little Henry Longuet was not to outlive childhood and died in 1883 at the age of 4. During the summer, Marx's wife, Jenny, was particularly ailing, her symptoms those of the cancer which would ultimately cause her death. Engels' wife, Lizzie, also became gravely ill and died on September 12, 1878. Jenny Marx spent the summer in Worcester. Is that how you say that? Worcester? Where Marx joined her from September 4th to 14th, 1878. After the second attempt on the life of Emperor Wilhelm, a bill was proposed to the Reichstag which would prohibit all socialist organizations and press organs on the ground that social democracy was a threat to the general welfare. Marx was half decided to prepare for the London Daily News a report on the Reichstag debates that ensued on September 16th to 17th concerning the proposed, quote, socialist law, end quote. On the basis of the official stenographic reports, he began working out a selection of the parliamentary statements and speeches and accompanied the lengthy quotations with his own commentary. After only a few pages, he interrupted his work and left the manuscript unfinished and unpublished. It is nevertheless relevant to note how Marx would have defended the social democracy against the attacks of the Prussian government. Refuting the pretended relation between social democracy and violence, Marx argued that the goal of this movement was simply the emancipation of the working class and the social reversal essential to this end. When the powers that be place no obstacles in the path of this historical development, the change may be achieved peacefully. For example, quote, if in England or in the United States the working class wins the majority of Parliament or Congress, it could then use legal means to abolish the laws and institutions obstructing its development, and this, of course, only to the extent demanded by this social development. Yet nevertheless, the, quote, peaceful, end quote, movement might change into a, quote, violent, end quote, one, if those interested in retaining the old conditions resist, end quote. When putting down the legally incontestable movement of the working class majority, the government uses whatever, quote, legal, end quote, means are still in its power and brands the workers as, quote, rebels. Marx had prepared only 7 pages for Book 2 of Capital during the summer and then interrupted his writing until November 1878, when he informed Danielson that Volume 2 would probably be finished in a year's time. Another Russian, the historian Maxim Kovalevsky, met Marx in London shortly after his return from Moscow, where he had taught at the university. He reported on the present commotion in the Russian press caused by a debate on capital and on the hostile and brutal treatment afforded the Montenegrin students by their Russian hosts. See Marx to Engels, September 17, 1878, and Marx to Danielson, November 15, 1878. Towards the end of the year, Marx made a number of comments on the status and future of the working class movement in America. He predicted that the Americans would try in vain, quote, to destroy the power of the monopolies and the fatal, as far as the immediate welfare of the masses is concerned, influence of the large companies, which since the outbreak of the Civil War had been usurped with ever-increasing speed by industry, landed property, and the railways and finance, end quote. Letter to Danielson, mid-November 1878. In an interview granted to a correspondent of the Chicago Tribune on December 18, 1878, published January 15, 1879, Marx said that America needed an independent working class party separate from trade union influence. Quote, they can no longer trust politicians. Rings and cliques have seized upon the legislature, and politics has been made a trade. But America is not alone in this. Only its people are more decisive than in Europe. Things come to the surface quicker. There's less cant and hypocrisy than there is on this side of the ocean. End quote. Asked about the effectiveness of socialism in guiding the international action of the working class, he remarked that proletarian action was a spontaneous movement whose purpose was unclear at the outset. The socialists indeed participate in the movement, but are not its initiators. They, quote, merely tell the workmen what its character and its ends will be, end quote. New section, 1879. Marx's own steadily worsening state of health and the illness of his wife prevented him from continuing the composition of Capital Volume 2, though he had covered an enormous amount of literature relevant to it. He read Kovalevsky's work on Russian rural communal property, studied Russian fiscal questions using material sent by Danielson, and put together an extensive bibliography on matriarchal law, Johann Jakob Bachhofen and Louis Henry Morgan. He also took up the history of ancient Rome and Greece, Johann Friedrichs Reitemeyer's Geschichte und Zustand der Sklaverei und Leibgegnerschaft in Griechenland of 1879, Rudolf von Eyring, Ludwig Lange, Ludwig Friedländer, and Karl Buchner on various aspects of ancient Roman institutions. One second. Sorry about that. Come on. Sorry. On England and its colonial affairs, Marx studied Alexander Redgrave's The Factory and Workshop Act, published in 1878, and his book on the textile factories, published in 1879. Francis W. Roswell's The Domesday Book of Bengal, published in 1879, and William Carleton's Traits and Stories of the Irish Peasantry, published in 1830. Sometime this year, he investigated the ideas of Jules Gued as presented in the book Collectivisme et Révolution, published in 1879. At the beginning of the year, Marx received a visit from the distinguished English diplomat Sir Mountstuart E. Grantduff, who conversed with Marx about the proletarian social movement. Sir Grantduff addressed a letter to the Empress Frederick of Germany shortly after his visit on the 31st of January 1879, candidly revealing his opinion of the Marxian views. Quote, "It was all very positive, positif, slightly cynical, without any appearance of enthusiasm, interesting and often, as I thought, showing very correct ideas when he was conversing of the past and the present, but vague and unsatisfactory when he turned to the future, ... But supposing I said the rulers of Europe came to an understanding amongst themselves for a reduction of armaments, which might greatly relieve the burden on the people, what would become of the revolution which you expect it one day to bring about?" Quote, "Ah," was his answer, they can't do that. All sorts of fears and jealousies will make that impossible. The burden will grow worse and worse as science advances, for the improvements in the art of destruction will keep pace with its advance, and every year more and more will have to be devoted to cost the engines of war. It is a vicious circle, there is no escape from it." End quote. The above will give your Imperial Highness a fair idea of the kind of ideas about the near future of Europe which are working in his mind. They are too dreamy to be dangerous, except just insofar as the situation with its mad expenditure on armaments is obviously and undoubtedly dangerous. If, however, within the next decade the rulers of Europe have not found means of dealing with this evil without any warning from attempted revolution, I, for one, shall despair of the future of humanity, at least on this continent." End quote. A meeting with Karl Marx, the Times Literary Supplement, July 15th, 1949. After several months of silence in his correspondence, Marx returned writing to Danielson in April 1879, and explained his long interruption as due to ill health. He now returned to discuss an earlier draft of Danielson's and took issue with the latter's comparison of America with Russia. It was impossible, he said, to find real analogies between the two countries. Quote, in the former, the expenses of the government diminish daily and its public debt is quickly and yearly reduced. In the latter, bankruptcy is a goal more and more appearing to become unavoidable. The former has freed itself, of its paper money. The latter has no more flourishing fabric than that of paper money. The latter reminds you rather of the times of Louis XIV and Louis XV, end quote. America was exceeding even England's tempo of industrial development, and its masses were quicker and endowed with greater political means to achieve their goals. In response to this critique, Danielson furnished Marx with detailed information on agricultural productivity in Russia, as taken from the Zemstvo Statistics, July 26, 1879. One second. Carlo Cafiero, one-time anarchist and outspoken enemy of the General Council and the IWA, had now become a popularizer of Marx's Capital. To my understanding, Carlo Cafiero remained an anarchist, but that's just and he was important for the development of anarchist communism, to my understanding at least. Cafiero sent Marx a recently published pamphlet containing his choice of excerpts from Marx's theoretical work and a preface. Marx thanked Cafiero on July 29th and commended the selection and composition of the pamphlet, whose merits were far superior to the previous efforts to make Capital accessible to a wider audience. However, the preface, Marx noted, lacked, quote, proof that the material conditions necessary for the emancipation of the proletariat are spontaneously produced with the advance of capitalist production, end quote. At a later date, he added, Cafiero might produce an enlarged edition which would place more emphasis on the, quote, materialist basis of, quote, Capital, the book Capital, end quote. Now that the socialist law had made socialist action legally impossible, Marx and Engels seriously considered collaborating on an illegal socialist news organ that Liebknecht and others wished to found. When assuring the SDAP of their participation, however, they emphasized that only Karl Hirsch was capable of editing such a journal, which would not make compromises with petty bourgeois elements in the party nor concessions to the government. After the new editors were announced to be Karl Hochberg and Edward Bernstein, Marx and Engels withdrew their support, basing their action on the likely prospect that Hochberg, quote, theoretically a very muddled head, end quote, would turn the paper into an organ of, quote, social philanthropy, end quote, and deny it the, quote, proletarian revolutionary, end quote, character essential to the working class political movement. Engels to August Bebel, August 4th, 1879. Marx spent nearly all of August and September at the seaside, first in Jersey, then in Ramsgate, after receiving news that Johnny Longuet, who was residing in Ramsgate, had given birth to a son Edgar on August 17, 1879. Marx remained with his daughter until late in September and reported to Engels that the sea air had a very favorable effect on his health. While in Ramsgate, Marx received from the labor offices in the American states of Ohio, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania a number of official publications and bulletins which Zorga had requested on his behalf. Engels also sent Marx a recent publication by Hochberg, the Jahrbuch für Sozialwissenschaft und Sozialpolitik, and asked for his opinion on how to proceed against Hochberg's activity within the German proletarian movement. Hochberg claimed that social democracy had brought the, quote, socialist law upon itself by transforming the socialist movement into a working class movement, a step which had served only to provoke the bourgeoisie. Marx replied that an immediate, blunt, and merciless stand must be taken against Hochberg and proposed that they first write in protest to the SDAP leaders before openly disavowing their relations with the German party. In both their names, Engels composed a, quote, circular letter, on September 17th to 18th, 1879, while Marx was still in Ramsgate, and sent it to the party leadership in Leipzig. In his letter, Engels exposed the falsity of these elements which had infiltrated the party in the belief that the working class was incapable of emancipating itself, but needed, quote, the leadership of, quote, educated and propertied, end quote, bourgeois, end quote, who would instruct the proletariat about its own interests. These, quote, educated Germans also thought that the bourgeoisie was not to be fought against but won over by propaganda. In short, they deny the class struggle as an unpleasant, quote, coarse, end quote, phenomenon, leaving only humanism and, quote, empty phraseology about, quote, justice, end quote, as the basis for socialism. While the movement needed people who would add, quote, educative elements, end quote, to it, Hochberg and his clique were not such people. Moreover, Engels emphasized, those from other classes who wished to join the proletarian movement had better drop their class prejudices and, quote, wholeheartedly adopt the proletarian viewpoint, end quote. Finally, Engels summed up the standpoint which he and Marx had defended for the past 40 years, the class struggle as the driving force in history. Quote, the emancipation of the working classes must be accomplished by the working classes themselves. Therefore, we cannot cooperate with people who openly state that the workers are too uneducated to emancipate themselves and must be freed from above by philanthropic grand and petit bourgeois, end quote. September 17th to 18th, 1879. Although Hochberg was nominally removed from the editorial staff of the Sozialdemokrat thereafter, the paper continued to give space to the petit bourgeois socialist, end quote, views of the Hochberg group. Marx and Engels consequently wrote to Babel on November 16, 1879, declaring that they could not lend their support to a party which permitted such viewpoints to have access to its official paper. New section, 1880. Marx worked regularly on the manuscripts for his for books 2 and 3 of Capital, while doing much reading on problems of land and soil and the fiscal problems pertaining to the development of predominantly agricultural countries. On ground rent, the Italian economist Achille Loria, on geology, G. Allen, as well as works on the Irish land question, Australian commercial development, and American and Indian agriculture. He read a work entitled La sociologie de après ethnographie, published in 1880 by the Frenchman Charles Letourneau, and studied the statistical books published by the Tsar's government in Moscow for the years 1877 to 79. Late in the year, he took 98 pages of notes on Morgan's work Ancient Society, published in 1877, and subsequently began extensive studies on ancient times. In English, Maine, Sir John Budd Spear and Sir William Boyd Dawkins. In German, Rudolf Zahm. In mid-March 1880, Marx received a letter from the French socialist Jules Gued, who professed to share Marx's views on the proletarian movement. He declared himself in favor of violence as a necessary means to achieve the party's goals, affirmed that a party must be founded as a, quote, conscious army before going into action, and added that for some time impulse and direction in the party would have to originate from, quote, above, i.e. from those who were more knowledgeable. Quote, under these conditions, end quote, Gued wrote, quote, I have devoted myself since my return to forming a, quote, independent and militant working men's party, end quote, which you quite rightly declare to be, quote, of the greatest importance, end quote, in view of the events now in the making, end quote. That's from the end of March 1880. For Gued and the French Socialist Party, Marx drew up an, quote, enquête ouvrière, a questionnaire which would enable them to compose a statistical picture of the living and working conditions of the proletariat, their mental and physical states of being, their relations to others within their class and to their employers. The list of 101 questions delved moreover into a matter of safety precautions in the factories or workshops, unemployment in terms of crises, the use of leisure time, strikes and their effects, trade unions and cooperative organizations within the given industrial sector. Marx's Misère de la Philosophie was republished in installments in Gued's Égalité beginning in April. In May 1880, both Gued and Paul Lafargue came to London to discuss with Marx and Engels the program of the French Socialist Working Men's Party, which the two Frenchmen and others were in the process of forming out of the existing Party of French Socialists. Gued wrote in French at Marx's dictation a theoretical introduction to the program beginning with a list of, quote, considérants, end quote, based on the Marxian view of proletarian emancipation. Quote, considering that the working class, without distinction as to race and sex, end quote, the program began, quote, can be free only when it is in collective possession of the means of production. The emancipatory endeavor must be undertaken through the action of an independent political party of the working masses using all means at their disposal, end quote. This introduction was followed by a, quote, minimal program, end quote, a, quote, means of organization and struggle, end quote, on the electoral front. In a letter to Zorga later in the year, November 5, 1880, Marx recounted his meeting with Gued and termed the program they had drawn up as a, quote, tremendous step forward, which brought the French down to earth from their, quote, cloud of phraseology, end quote. The subsequent adoption of this program by nearly all political working men's groups proved in Marx's eyes that, quote, this is the first and real labor movement in France. This is the first and real labor movement in France, end quote. A French translation by Lafargue of the most interesting theoretical sections from Engels' Anti-During now appeared in the French monthly La Revue Socialiste under the title, quote, Socialisme, Utopie et Socialisme Scientifique. March to May 1880. These same excerpts were later brought out in book form with a preface by Marx, who remarked that Engels' writing represented, quote, in a certain sense, an introduction to scientific socialism, end quote. In June, Marx's doctors forbade him to work. He was suffering from nervous exhaustion, but the progressively worsening state of his wife's health prohibited him from going to the continent for treatment. The whole family, including the two sons-in-law, spent the month from mid-August to mid-September in Ramsgate. As Marx wrote to Danielson, he had been sent to the sea, quote, to do nothing and to cure my nerves by far niente, end quote. September 12, 1880. Because of his state of health, he was unable to furnish Danielson with the requested article on Russian economics, but advised his friend himself to publish the statistical evaluations he had made on agricultural reforms in Russia, and authorized him to use any material from his letters which might be of value for his writing. After his return to London, Marx met Liebknecht, who had come to discuss the problems within the party ranks caused by the infiltration of opportunistic elements. Marx and Engels declared their intention of refraining from interference in internal party difficulties and intrigues on the staff of their, quote, miserable paper, the Social-Democrat. Liebknecht promised to begin a renewal and improvement of this party organization. On behalf of the victims of the, quote, socialist law, Marx solicited material aid from the journalist John Swinton in New York, November 4th, 1880. In September 1880, he studied the program of the Russian terrorist organization Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, whose headquarters were in St. Petersburg. He was in close contact to one of their exiled members, Lev Hartmann, presently living in London. This group stood in opposition to the anarchist propaganda organization, which was named after its periodical, Czerny Paradel, or Black Repartition. The former group, Marx wrote to Zorga, November 5th, along with the intellectuals at the Russian university, showed great interest in his writings. Anticipating the publication of Volume 2 of Capital, Marx asked Charles Darwin's permission to dedicate the work to him. Darwin replied on October 13th that consent would imply approval, and since he knew nothing of the subject in question, he could not consent. Darwin wished, moreover, to avoid injuring the religious feelings of his family and feared that Marx's book contained, quote, direct arguments against Christianity and theism, end quote. Charles Darwin. In connection with the work on Capital, Marx now requested from Zorga material and industrial development in California, noting that, quote, California is very important for me because nowhere else has the upheaval caused by capitalist centralization been accomplished in such a shameless way at such a rapid tempo, end quote. Marx, November 5, 1880. In the following months, he examined statistical material on the American economic situation and read The Kearney Agitation in California, 1880, by Henry George. An international meeting was held in Geneva to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1830 Polish Revolution in November 1880. Marx, Engels, Lafargue, and Lessner addressed an open letter to the Assembly. As former members of the General Council of the IWA, they called attention to the intimate relationship between the Polish emancipatory movement and the overthrow of the existing military and political structure in Europe. The Polish insurrection of 1863 had, in particular, quote, by occasioning the common protest of England and French working men against the international intrigues of their government, formed the point of departure for the International, end quote, which was founded in 1864. The English social reformer Henry Mayer Hindman, who was entertaining plans to found an English working-class party, met Marx frequently during this year. Hindman's decided opposition to violent revolution as a means of emancipating the working class provoked Marx to a letter written December 8, 1880, which qualified the circumstances under which he held violence to be necessary. In England, Marx said, revolution did not appear to be necessary, yet it remained a possibility. The working class gains peaceful concessions from the government only through pressure from without. When the proletariat fails to use its legal freedoms and powers efficiently, this pressure breaks down. Quote, if the inevitable evolution turns into a revolution, it would be the fault not only of the ruling classes, but of the working class as well, end quote. He cited Germany as an example of how the proletarian movement, while keeping within the bounds of legality, nevertheless comes into conflict with the government. In the case of the SDAP, quote, their crimes were not deeds, but opinions, which displeased their sovereigns, end quote. December 8, 1880. Sometime between late 1879 and the end of 1880, Marx began a critique and refutation of passages in Adolf Wagner's Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie, textbook of political economy, which attributed to Marx a, quote, socialist system, end quote, and falsely construed his value theory. Marx made some 20-odd pages of notes and commentary, but left the work unfinished. Wagner failed, for example, to differentiate between the theories of Marx and Ricardo, the theories of Ricardo having dealt with labor, quote, only as a measure of value, end quote, and therefore established no connection between value theory and the, quote, essence of money, end quote, as had Marx. Ricardo had, moreover, confounded value and production costs, whereas Marx had emphasized as early as the 1859 Critique that, quote, values and production prices, which express simply the cost of production in money terms, do not coincide, end quote. Stating that commodities as values have a, quote, double nature, end quote. Marx rejected the argument that certain goods have a social use value for the commodity as a whole. Quote, where the state itself is a capitalist producer, as in the exploitation of mines, woodland, etc., its product is a, quote, commodity, end quote, and has therefore the specific nature of every other commodity. Quote, value, according to Marx, represents only the, quote, social character of labor, end quote, and is produced through the, quote, expenditure of, quote, social, end quote, labor power, end quote. Wagner also attributed to Marx the view that surplus value created by the worker was, quote, unjustly, end quote, appropriated by the capitalist. On the contrary, Marx replied, quote, at a certain point the production of commodities necessarily becomes, quote, capitalist, end quote, commodity production, and, according to the law of value which governs this production system, the, quote, surplus value, end quote, is due not to the working man but to the capitalist, end quote. New section, 1881. Marx's interest in Russia continued. During the course of this year, he studied the development of Russian economy since the emancipation of the serfs. Skrbitsky, Golovachev, Skaldin, Danielson, Jansen, Chernivtsi. America, on the other hand, provided the field for his investigation of big business, and in this connection, he read articles from the Atlantic Monthly, Lloyd's The Story of a Great Monopoly, published in 1881, about the Standard Oil Company, House's The Martyrdom of an Empire, published in 1881, also Groman on, quote, cattle ranchers in the far west, end quote, 1880, and Cliff Leslie's article on, quote, political economy in the United States, end quote. From 1879, from the Fortnightly Review. He promised the Narodnaya Volya an article on the Russian rural commune. His contact with Danielson continued, and when two Russian economists, Sibir and Kablikov, visited London in January, Marx was afforded a further opportunity to become acquainted with contemporary economic thought in their country. After reading Danielson's outline of Russian political economy since the reform, he wrote the author a lengthy appraisal in letter of February 19, 1881. Danielson's work was, quote, in the best sense of the word, quote, original, end quote, and Marx now encouraged him to investigate the problem of the, quote, wonderfully increasing indebtedness of the landlords, the upper-class representatives of agriculture, end quote. He explained to Danielson as well the reason for Russia's cycle of good and bad harvests. Finally, he spoke of the system employed by the British railways of incurring new debts to pay off the old, in essence the same method used for European public debts, and remarked that, quote, this pleasant method must one day or another terminate in an ugly catastrophe, end quote. February 19, 1881. On February 18, 1881, that quote was from February 19, 1881. And then the next part says, on February 18, 1881, Marx received a letter from the revolutionary Vera Sasulich, a member of the Geneva group Black Repartition, who had won a certain notoriety through her attempted assassination of Prefect Teprov in 1878. Vera Sasulich posed Marx the question of Russia's future economic and social development. Would her country have to be transformed on the basis of capitalist industry, or could the rural commune be used to found a new collective order? She alluded to certain Russian, quote, Marxists who held the first opinion and condemned the revolutionary Narodniki, the populace who supported the rural commune, to the role of passive spectators in this economic transformation. Sasulich's letter inspired Marx, despite his illness and his other obligations, to undertake a thorough investigation of Russia's socioeconomic structure. Considering the peculiarities of that country's historical development, he was unwilling to apply without reflection to its situation the conclusions he had drawn from the study of West European countries. Marx now made 3 long drafts in French for a reply to Vera Sasulich's questions before composing the final letter in a very succinct and sketchy form. Russia, he began in the first draft, could gradually develop the rural commune to an element of collective production on a national scale, since it was contemporary with capitalist production. The commune had moreover the advantage of being able to appropriate capitalism's positive achievements without suffering capitalism's same instability and crises. Capitalism now found itself in a period of serious crisis, quote, in opposition to science, to the popular masses, and to the productive forces to which it gives rise. In short, in a crisis will end only with its own abolition, with the return of modern societies to the, quote, archaic type of property and collective production, end quote. To the third draft, Marx added that the rural commune, which still existed in many Asian countries, was in fact, quote, the most recent type, end quote, the, quote, last word, end quote, in archaic social forms, and that the same could be said of the German rural community. The Russian rural commune was unique in that it existed both on a national scale and in a modern, quote, historic milieu, end quote, which made it the contemporary of a higher culture and connected to a world market in which capitalist production predominated. However, for the rural commune to remain viable as an institution under threat from within through the spread of private property and from without by technological progress, quote, a Russian revolution is necessary to save the Russian commune, end quote. Quote, if the revolution should take place at the right moment, if it concentrates all its forces to ensure that the commune may develop freely, the commune will soon become an element of social regeneration in Russia and of superiority over the countries enslaved by the capitalist regime, end quote. In the letter which Marx actually sent to Vera Sassulich, dated March 8, 1881, he said that to clear her mind of doubts about his, quote, so-called theory, end quote, Capital contained no arguments for or against the peasant commune. Apart from Capital, however, his research on Russia had convinced him that the commune would be the mainspring of its social regeneration, but that to make certain it would also function as such, quote, one would first have to eliminate the deleterious influences which assail the commune from every direction, and then secure it the normal conditions for natural development, end quote. Not long after receiving Vera Sassulich's question, he was asked another by F. de Mella Neuenhuis. I think that's how you say it. Neuenhaus? I'm not sure how you say it, actually. Regarding the measures that a socialist government should take after, quote, victory. Marx replied to his Dutch comrade that it was impossible to answer such a question at present, that, quote, we cannot solve any equation which does not have the elements of its solution within the given data, end quote. It was certain that no socialist government would ever be installed in a country which failed to provide those conditions that would enable it, quote, to intimidate the bourgeois mass and thus gain time, the first desideratum for lasting action, end quote. December 22nd, 1881. The Paris Commune, Marx explained, could not be taken as an example of or model for a socialist government, since only a minority of its members had been socialist, while the uprising itself had not extended beyond the capital under exceptional circumstances of war. Such conjecture about the future program of action, Marx found, only diverted attention from the immediate struggle. Scientific insight into the change presently in progress should be, quote, sufficient guarantee that at the moment when a really proletarian revolution breaks out, the conditions of its immediate, direct, albeit certainly not idyllic, modus operandi will be given as well. End quote. Unable to attend a Slav meeting presided over by Lev Hartmann on March 21, 1881 in London, Marx and Engels sent a message in which they welcomed the recent events in St. Petersburg, the attempted assassination of the Tsar 10 years after the defeat of the Paris Commune, as a harbinger of the Russian Commune to come. March 21, 1881. At this time, Marx was in contact with the Russian revolutionary Tchaikovsky, who informed him about the attack on the Tsar and the persons involved, members of the St. Petersburg terrorist group Narodnaya Volya. In a letter to his daughter Jenny, Marx described these people as, quote, thoroughly capable, simple, objective, heroic, end quote. Their aim was not to preach, quote, tyrannicide as, quote, theory and, quote, panacea, end quote, but to teach Europe that their way was, quote, specifically Russian, a historically inevitable mode of action, end quote, and that all moralizing about it was utterly meaningless. He attacked sharply, by contrast, the Geneva Cherny-Paradel Russians, quote, doctrinaire, confused anarcho-socialists, end quote, who lacked any influence whatsoever on the present course of events in their home country. April 11th, 1881. In mid-April 1881, Marx received from the St. Petersburg group a message praising his work and soliciting his assistance in awakening Europe's sympathy and support for the Russian revolutionary movement. On the 29th of April 1881, Marx wrote a letter to Jenny congratulating her on the birth of her fourth son, Marcel. Children born today, he predicted, have before them, quote, the most revolutionary period which human beings have ever had to live through. It is not good to be so old when one is capable only of foreseeing and not of seeing, end quote. April 29th, 1881. Early in June 1881, Marx broke off relations with Heinemann, whom he had often advised in recent months on the rapprochement between British trade union leaders, represented by Heinemann, and members of Parliament who were interested in forming a new working men's party. Heinemann had provoked this rupture by quoting long passages from Capital without giving the source, reasoning that Marx's name was anathema among the British. Marx to Zorga, December 15th, 1881. He did, however, acknowledge in the preface his indebtedness, quote, to the work of a great and original writer, end quote. When writing to Zorga in New York on June 20th, 1881, Marx commented on a book by an American author which he read during the first half of the year. Henry George proposed in Progress and Poverty, a book, that the solution to the problem of economic disparity would be the public appropriation of land rent. This proposal was not new, Marx remarked. It originated with the bourgeois economists of the 18th century and was mentioned in the Communist Manifesto as one of the transitional measures leading to communist society. Both George and the bourgeois economists had overlooked surplus value and thus left wage labor and capitalist production fundamentally unchanged. Quote, the whole thing is simply an attempt, trimmed with socialism, to save capitalist rule, and indeed to reestablish it on an even wider basis than its present one. End quote. Marx reproached George as an American economist, moreover, for having failed to investigate the fact that even in his country, where land was accessible to the broad masses, quote, capitalist economy and the corresponding enslavement of the working class have developed more rapidly and more shamelessly than in any other country, exclamation point, end quote. Marx, June 20th, 1881. Despite the steadily declining state of his wife's health, Marx acquiesced to Jenny's desire that he and Despite the steadily declining state of his wife's health, Marx acquiesced in Jenny's desire that he and Helena Demuth accompany her to Argenteuil, near Paris, for a visit with her daughter and grandchildren. They stayed in France from July 26 until the middle of August 1881, when, alerted that Eleanor in London had suffered a nervous collapse, Marx returned to him immediately. His wife returned several days later with Helena, and from this time on, until her death some 4 months later, remained bedridden. In October 1881, Marx contracted pleurisy, which was complicated with bronchitis and the beginnings of pneumonia. For several days, Marx's life was in serious danger, as he recounted to Danielson, quote, for 3 of the last 6 weeks of her life, I was unable to see my wife, although we lay in 2 adjoining rooms, end quote. Marx, December 13th, 1881. Marx was, quote, rather disagreeably affected, end quote, by a letter he received from Meissner at the end of October 1881, notifying him that a 3rd edition of Capital Volume 1 was now necessary, for he wished to devote himself entirely to finishing the 2nd volume. On November 30th, 1881, he was sent a copy of E. Belfort Bax's article, number 12 in the series Leaders of Modern Thought, which portrayed Marx as one of the great modern socialist thinkers and economists. The praise and recognition of her husband's work lightened the last days of Jenny Marx's life, for she succumbed to her long illness on December 2nd, 1881. Marx, still suffering from his bronchitis, was advised by the doctors not to leave the house. Remembering his wife's words shortly before her death, quote, we are no such external people, end quote. Marx to Jenny Longuet, December 7th, 1881. Marx stayed away from his wife's funeral. Engels spoke at the graveside, paying tribute to this woman with the sharp, critical mind, so much tact and energy, who never sought public acclaim or attention for herself. Quote, what she achieved only those who have lived with her know. Yet I am sure that we shall often miss her spirited and clever counsels, spirited without ostentation, clever without betraying anything of honor, ... If there was ever a woman who found her greatest happiness in making others happy, then it was this woman, end quote. Engels, 1881. New section, 1882. Marx spent the greater part of 1882 on the Isle of Wight and the other side of the Channel in search of warmer, drier climate than England. Despite illness and the distractions of travel, he found time to read a number of works on Egypt, then a book by the English naturalist John Lubbock entitled The Origin of Civilization and the Primitive Condition of Man, published in 1870, and to continue his studies on Russia, especially its agricultural situation, Gerhard Minayko, Alexander Engelhardt, Vasily Semevsky, Alexander Skrbitsky. He read in the original Russian Vorontsov's Sud by Kapitalism и России, bracket, The Fate of Capitalism in Russia, 1882, end bracket. The doctors advised Marx and Eleanor to stay in Ventor on the Isle of Wight during January 1881. Eleanor, Marx wrote to Laura, quote, is very laconic and seems indeed to endure the sojourn with me only out of the sense of duty as a self-sacrificing martyr, end quote. January 4th, 1882. No, shit. What did I say earlier? Fuck. I don't know. The doctors advised Marx and Eleanor to stay in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight during January 1882. Eleanor, Marx wrote to Laura, quote, is very laconic and seems indeed to endure the sojourn with me only out of the sense of duty as a self-sacrificing martyr, end quote. January 4th, 1882. His youngest was under mental pressure that was destroying her health, and Marx did not want, quote, for anything in the world that this child should imagine herself being sacrificed on the family altar in the role of, quote, nurse, end quote, to an old man, end quote. Marx to Engels, January 12, 1882. On January 16, 1882, they returned to London. Marx's condition was much improved, but he was advised to escape the damp London fog as soon as possible and seek the warmth of the Mediterranean in Algiers. Marx also corresponded with Engels from Ventnor on matters other than his and Eleanor's health. On January 5th, 1882, he reported receiving a letter from Dietzken concerning the latter's recent studies in, quote, dialectic cognition, end quote, and the work of Hegel. To this, Marx commented sarcastically that, quote, the poor fellow has gone forward, quote, backwards, and, quote, arrived at the phenomenology. I consider the case incurable, end quote. In a letter written on the 12th, he criticized the reform proposals of the Swiss economist Karl Bjerkli, which he learned about in the journal Arbeiterstimme. Berkeley's system of, quote, interest-bearing mortgage banknotes, end quote, originated with the Pole August Kishovsky. I forget how to say that. I think it's Kishkovsky or Kishkowski. I don't know. Marx remarked, and the same ideas of credit money had been discussed as early as the founding of the Bank of England. Before Marx left for the continent on February 9, 1882, he and Engels compared a preface to the new second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, recalling that the first edition of the manifesto in 1847 ignored completely the position of the proletarian movements in America and Russia. The authors now offered a brief description of the progress registered in those great countries and characterized Russia as the, quote, vanguard of revolutionary action in Europe, end quote. Here as well, Vera Sasulich's question about the future of the Russian Obshchina, put to Marx a year earlier, resounded, and the reply was, quote, the only possible answer to this today is, should the Russian Revolution become the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that the two complement one another, the present system of communal land ownership in Russia may serve as the departure point for communist development, end quote. Marx, 1882. On his way to Algiers, Marx spent several days with Jenny and her family and had occasion to speak with the socialist leaders Ged, Gabriel Deville, and Jose Mesa in Paris. By the time he arrived in Africa, he was again suffering from pleurisy and found the weather there disappointingly cold and damp. On the 1st of March, he wrote Engels a detailed account of his state of health since his arrival. Apart from his pleurisy and bronchitis, the loss of his wife caused Marx much suffering, and he wrote Engels that he was frequently overcome by waves of, quote, profunda melancholia, end quote. The letters Marx composed during this year were written in a peculiar mixture of English, German, and French, more so than was his usual habit, and contained an abundance of errors in construction and grammar. He noticed this fact himself, but, he told Engels, the realization always came, quote, post festum. Shows you that as regards the sana mens in sano corpe, there's still something to be done, end quote. March 28th to 31st, 1882. He visited a friend of Charles Langeais in Algiers, the civil judge Albert Ferme, who told Marx about the Arab customs for regulating land ownership and described the system of colonial oppression. Judges who did not comply with the colonialist demands to sentence innocent Arabs to prison were in grave danger of losing their own lives in that country. According to Ferme, however, quote, The British and the Dutch surpassed the French with their shameless arrogance, pretentiousness, and cruel Moloch-like passion for vengeance on the, quote, lower races, end quote, end quote. Marx to Engels, April 8th, 1882. The adverse weather gave Marx no respite from his chronic bronchitis, and he finally decided to return to the French coast, where the weather was reported to have been exceptionally dry during the past months. He spent a month from May 7th to June 7th in Monte Carlo, where he was pursued, however, by inclement weather. The region impressed him with its great natural beauty, quote, enhanced by art. I am referring to the gardens, which have been extended as if by magic up the barren cliffs and descend from precipitous heights, often right down to the edge of the delightful blue sea, like terraced hanging Babylonian gardens, end quote, he wrote Eleanor on May 28, 1882. However, he confessed having little desire to visit Monaco's chief attraction and enterprise, the casinos. In gambling, quote, there can be no question of intelligence, calculation, etc., based on some sort of evaluation of probabilities. You can only reckon with, quote, chance favoring you, provided you have a sufficient sum to wager, ... And with all that, end quote, he exclaimed, quote, what child's play the casino is compared to the stock market, end quote. The excellent medical treatment which he received enabled him to banish the last traces of pleurisy, although his lungs were permanently weakened from the long series of infections. In June, he traveled to Argenteuil and went from there to Enghien each day to drink the waters at the mineral springs. Although much of this day was taken up with the trip to Enghien, and with his grandchildren, Marx still found time to read 2 new pamphlets by the Italian economist Achille Loria, and reached the same negative conclusion about their contents as did Engels. They decided that henceforth their attitude towards Loria could only be, quote, ironically defensive, end quote. To Engels, August 3rd, 1882. After several weeks in Switzerland, Vevey, Lausanne, and Geneva, accompanied by his daughter Laura, Marx returned briefly to Paris, where he observed the goings-on of the 2 wings of the French Socialist Party, Parti des Travailleurs Socialistes, at their respective congresses in Rouen and Saint-Étienne. Quote, Marxist and, quote, anti-Marxist, end quote, he wrote Engels, quote, both types have done their best to spoil my stay in France, end quote. Marx, September 30th, 1882. Marx spent but 3 weeks in London before returning to Ventnor on November 3rd, 1882, where a new bronchial infection restricted his activities and forced him to stay indoors. He read about the recent experiments of the French physicist Marcel Duprez, who had demonstrated the long-distance transmission of electrical impulses at the Munich Electrical Exposition. In connection with his study of Duprez's work, Marx also read Edward Hospitalier, Edouard Hospitalier on La physique moderne, les principales applications de l'électricité of 1880, and, inspired by remarks by Samuel Moore passed on to him by Engels, studied differential calculus. After looking through Lafargue's recent articles in Égalité, he wrote to Engels that it was high time Lafargue put an end to his, quote, childish boasting about future revolutionary atrocities, end quote, and abandon his role as the, quote, patented oracle of scientific socialism, end quote. November 11th, 1882. For Marx, Lafargue was, quote, the last disciple of Bakunin who seriously believes in him, end quote, and his other son-in-law was, quote, the last of the Proudhonists, que le diable le importe, end quote, he exclaimed to Engels. On November 2nd to 3rd, 1882, Engels reported to Bernstein that Lafargue and the other, quote, self-styled Marxist, self-styled, quote, Marxist, end quote, had often provoked Marx to say, quote, one thing is certain, that I am no Marxist, end quote. This remark can, of course, also be taken as a protest against any kind of name worship as fetishistic and contrary to the principles of self-emancipation on which the working class movement is based. Marx also wrote to Laura, referring indirectly to her husband, that anarchists, quote, are in fact pillars of the existing order and do not derange anything. In spite of themselves, it is their own heads which are innately le chaos. End quote. Further on in the same letter, he reported on his growing popularity in Russia, where his success delighted him more than in any other country, for he felt he was damaging a power which together with England formed the true bulwark of the old society. December 14th, 1882. Marx reported on December 18th, 1882, from Vent Nord, that he found Engels' recent article on, quote, the Mark, end quote, very good, and that the Channel weather was cool and damp. New section, 1883. On January 11th, 1883, Jenny Longuet died in Paris of a serious pulmonary disease presumed to have been tuberculosis. Eleanor went immediately to Vent Nord to fetch her father, who was suffering from another attack of bronchitis. In London, he developed an ulcer on one lung, which ultimately caused his death on March 14, 1883. Eleanor later recounted how, quote, he went out of his bedroom to his study in Maitland Park, sat down in his armchair, and calmly passed away, end quote. Quoted in Liebknecht in Reminiscences. To Engels fell the task of informing his comrades in arms about their great loss. He began on the day of Marx's death with letters to Liebknecht and Bernstein. To the latter, quote, only one who was constantly with him can imagine what this man was worth to us as a theorist and at all decisive moments in practical matters as well. His genial views are going to disappear with him from the scene for a long time to come. Those are things which are still beyond the capacities of the rest of us. The movement will take its course, but it will miss the calm, timely, and considered intervention which has saved it hitherto from many a wrong and wearisome path. End quote. And to Liebknecht, quote, what we all are, we are through him, and what the movement is today, it is thanks to his theoretical and practical activity. Without him, we should still be stuck in the mire of confusion, end quote. Engels. On the following day, March 15th, Engels wrote the news to Zorga, quote, death is not a misfortune for him who dies, but for him who survives, end quote. He used to say, quoting Epicurus, and to this mighty genius lingering on as a physical wreck for the greater glory of medicine and as an object of ridicule for the Philistines, ... No, it is 1,000 times better as it is, 1,000 times better that we bear him the day after tomorrow to the grave where his wife lies at rest, end quote. Engels, March 15th, 1883. The burial took place on March 17th, 1883 at Highgate Cemetery in the north of London. Engels again, for the second time in 15 months, spoke at this graveside. He addressed the participants in English. Quote, just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history, the simple fact hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter, and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc., that therefore the production of the immediate material means of subsistence and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given epoch form the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas of religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must, therefore, be explained instead of vice versa, as had hitherto been the case. But that is not all. Marx also discovered the special law of motion governing the present-day capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois society that this mode of production has created. The discovery of surplus value suddenly threw light on the problem in trying to solve which all previous investigations of both bourgeois economists and socialist critics had been groping in the dark. ... Such is the man of science, but this was not even half the man. Science was for Marx a historically dynamic revolutionary force. For Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute, in one way or another, to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was first to make conscious of its own position and its needs, conscious of the conditions of its emancipation. End quote. Engels. Marx's son-in-law, Longuet, next read an address sent by Lavrov in the name of the Russian socialists. Quote, "The Russian socialists bow before the grave of the man who sympathized with their strivings in all the vicissitudes of their terrible struggle, a struggle which they shall continue until the principles of the social revolution have finally been triumphant. The Russian language was the first to have a translation of Capital, the gospel of contemporary socialism. The students of the Russian universities were the first whose fortune it was to hear a favorable presentation of the theories of this powerful thinker whom we have now lost." ... End quote. Telegraphic messages were read from the French Workers' Party in Paris and the Spanish Workers' Party in Madrid, and finally Liebknecht spoke in the name of the German Social Democrats, confirming the words that had already been uttered about his, quote, "unforgettable teacher and faithful friend," end quote. Engels' second task was, together with Eleanor, to prepare for publication the many manuscripts Marx had left. He immediately investigated the drafts for Capital and found that Marx had accumulated more than 1,000 pages for the second and third books, which he now expected to publish in one volume. It was not until 1885, however, that Engels managed to finish recopying, editing, and constructing the second book, which he then published as a separate volume, while the third book did not follow until 1894. Apart from his role as literary executor, Engels suddenly found himself defending his friendship with Marx, a relationship which many believed to have been detrimental to one or the other. Quote, "The refrain of the bad Engels who seduced the good Marx has been sung countless times since 1844, alternating with the other refrain about Ehrenmann Marx, who led Ormuzd Engels astray of the virtuous path." End quote. Engels to Bernstein, April 23, 1883. New section, 1883 to 1885. In the years which intervened before his death in 1895 from cancer. Oh shit, that's a typo again. 1883 to 1895. In the years which intervened before his death in 1895 from a cancer of the digestive tract, Engels prepared the following editions and reeditions of works by Marx, or by them both. In 1883, he wrote a preface to the third German edition of the Communist Manifesto. Here he declared the idea of proletarian revolution as the key to the emancipation of all society from capitalist oppression, exploitation, and from class struggle. Quote, "This fundamental idea belongs solely and exclusively to Marx." End quote. A fourth German edition was brought out in 1890, an English edition in 1888, translated by their friend Samuel Moore. In 1892, a Polish edition in 1893 in Italian. In 1885, Engels prepared a new edition of the Revelations on the Communist Trial in Cologne, prefacing it with a, quote, "history of the Communist League," end quote. Also a third edition of the 18th Brumaire, and a German edition, translated by Kautsky, of the Poverty of Philosophy. In 1886, he published Marx's Theses on Feuerbach in an appendix to his own writing entitled Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. The critique of the Gotha program appeared as a pamphlet for the first time in 1891, and in the same year a re-edition of The Civil War in France and a Spanish translation of The Poverty of Philosophy, whose second German edition came out in 1892. In 1884, Engels republished Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, which had first appeared in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in 1849. An English edition of this text was brought out in 1885 along with Marx's speeches before the Cologne jury in the trials of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, including his publication of 1849 on the matter of Brentano versus Marx for alleged falsifications of documents, were Marx's articles from 1872. On the basis of Marx's excerpt notes and critical remarks on Lewis Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, Engels composed The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, published in 1884. Finally, in 1895, shortly before his death, Engels finished a reedition of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung review articles on the class struggle in France. The end. Thank you for listening.